Hey everyone, welcome back. Azim here. We're going to talk about bones of the face. We were just talking about bones of the cranium. This is chapter 7. We are starting on slide 10. Previous slides 1 through 9 were about bones of the cranium, fontanelles, sutures, and bones that border and protect the brain. Here we're talking about bones on the anterior portion of the whole cephalic region, on the anterior portion of the skull. Bones of the face, as well as we'll talk about the hyoid and the auditory ossicles as well. Bones of the face, by being in the anterior portion of our head, they help regulate, they help protect things including breathing, respiration, digestion, eating food, and your special sense organs, like your eyes, your ears, your tongue, and your nose. There are many passageways then to help provide blood vessels and nerves to and from these organs. Passageways for breathing, passageways for eating, passageways for getting information like light, like sound, like taste, like smell from the outer environment into us. We also have a really important joint here, the first joint that we'll be discussing, the Temporomandibular Joint. This is the joint between your temporal bone and your mandible, hence Temporomandibular Joint, the movable joint that you use not only for talking, but for chewing, for mastication. There are a total of 14 bones of the face. There are a total of 14 bones of the face. Many of them come in pairs. The vomer and the mandible are the only ones that are unpaired. There's only one of each. So we'll take a look at each one of these as we go through. What will help you in memorizing all these different bones is grouping them into different groups based on their function and location. So this first group, together, they're called the hard palate. Hard because it's hard, palate because it's a flat surface. The hard palate is the roof of your mouth. It's the roof of your oral cavity. Or you could think of this also as the floor of your nasal cavity. The roof of your oral cavity, the floor of your nasal cavity. If you feel with your tongue on the roof of your mouth, you'll feel ridges. Those ridges are called plici. A singular ridge is called a plica, but plural, it's plici. AE is an E sound. These ridges in your mucous membrane help break down food. You can push with your tongue against it to move food, and move food as you swallow towards your pharynx. In these mid-sagittal pictures, you can see the hard palate here and over here. The hard palate is made up of two bones. The maxillae make up one of those bones. Sorry, let me point it out here. The maxilla in the bottom picture is pointed out here in orange. The maxilla actually takes up a good portion of your face, the middle portion of your face. It houses your teeth, your upper teeth at least, and there's one on either side, one maxilla on the right side, one maxilla on the left side, plural maxillae. We'll take a closer look and complete anatomy coming up. So the maxilla forms the most anterior portion of the hard palate and most of it. The posterior portion of your hard palate is the Palatine Bone. Palatine. Palate, palatine. It forms the posterior portion of their hard palate. The Palatine Bone is actually kind of L-shaped. You can't really see it like this. We'll see it in complete anatomy. It has a flat portion and then a portion that goes more superiorly. So the maxillae and the Palatine bones, there are two of each, form the hard palate. There are several bones that surround and protect your eye. These are collectively known as your bony orbit. Your bony orbits protect your eye. One bone that you might think directly protects your eye, but does not, is your nasal bone. So your nasal bone, which would be not very visible here. It's visible right here. That's the nasal bone. The nasal bone, which forms a bridge, the superior portion of your nasal cavity, that's for your nasal cavity. It's not directly protecting your eyes. It's not directly bordering your eyes. I know that if you like go like this and I don't know, it's kind of protecting, but not exactly. It's not directly surrounding your eyes. So we don't count the nasal bone as part of the bony orbit. So that's why it's not listed here. What is listed here is the frontal bone. You can see the frontal bone around, we're showing the right eye in this picture, anterior view. Frontal bone forms a superior border. The maxilla. Maxilla forms much of the inferior and a little bit medial. Deeper and medial, you have the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone is where your lacrimal duct is, your tear duct, and it'll drain into your nasal cavity. It's one reason why if you cry a lot, your nose gets runny because there are tears coming from your eyes into your nasal cavity through that lacrimal duct. Lacrimal bone, very medial, just a little bit posterior to the maxilla. And a little bit more posterior to that, which is, let me try that again with a different color. Here it is in black. Here's the ethmoid. The ethmoid and the lacrimal bone form the medial wall of the orbit. There are two lacrimal bones. It's this really small bone here on one side, small bone on the other. There's only one ethmoid. One frontal, two maxillae, two lacrimal, one ethmoid. In the very back, that's the sphenoid. We went over that in the last video. Forms a posterior wall of the orbit. And then on the lateral edge, forming your cheekbone, the lateral edge, that's the zygomatic bone. The word zygo, like zygote, we learned about the zygote, that's a fusion of an egg and sperm. Zygomatic, zygote means to yoke, to bring it together. The zygomatic bone is bringing together your temporal bone of your cranium to your facial bones. It's linking together your face to your cranium, zygomatic. Bones that are found in the nasal cavity are very interesting. They have a very unique shape, and they are there to help air flow through, increase surface area, and maximize warming up the air because air is generally colder than our body temperature, humidify air because air is generally drier than our body, than our mucous membranes, and filter the air because air is often filled with impurities. It's rarely just pure oxygen. We're getting dust and smoke and other things. We want to make sure the air that gets to our lungs is as pure as possible. If it isn't, then that can damage our lungs. So, as you might know, the nasal cavity is separated into left and right. There's a wall in between the two nasal cavities. The term for wall is septum. So the wall between your nasal cavities is the nasal septum. Septum means wall. There are two bones that form the nasal septum. One of those bones is called the vomer. Vomer means a plow. You'll see that it's shaped like a little plow-like triangle thing. There's one vomer bone, very thin and flat. The other bone is the ethmoid. We saw how the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid shown here forms part of the nasal septum. This is a frontal cut of a cadaver. What I'm coloring in yellow is the vomer. What I've colored there in light blue is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. That forms your nasal septum. We're cutting into the nasal cavity here of this cadaver. Vomer and ethmoid, specifically the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, make up the nasal septum. Now you might notice that there are curvatures coming off of this nasal cavity region. I've just made 3 curves, 1, 2, 3. The topmost ones, those are superior nasal conchae, part of the ethmoid bone. The ones in the middle are middle nasal conchae, also part of the ethmoid bone. You can see those 2 things here. Middle nasal concha, superior nasal concha. The most inferior one though, which I'm going to color now in red, these circular portions, or I've circled them here, but they're conch shaped like a conch shell. Those are the inferior nasal conchae. They are individual bones. Inferior nasal conchae are individual bones, tiny bones shaped like tiny little shells. We'll have a look at that coming up, and also those videos in YouTube under my playlists. These 3 structures, but together just 2 bones. Well, I guess you've got 2 inferior nasal conchae and then 1 ethmoid. So 3 bones, but these 3 features make up what are called turbinates. Turbinates are these curvatures lined with mucous membrane, specifically with pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. Remember that epithelium type? It's there to help catch any particles in its mucus and sweep it out. It's what helps you form your boogers. Boogers are a good thing. You're getting rid of stuff that shouldn't go deeper into your respiratory tract. Right, so your nasal conchae, increasing surface area to swirl the air around. That's why it's curved shaped. That's why it's shaped like a shell. To swirl the air, increase surface area for conditioning. We want to maximize surface area as we breathe in through our nose as much as possible. So we have those turbinates, those different nasal conchae. We also have paranasal sinuses. Paranasal sinuses are airways connecting to the nasal cavity that further increase surface area and are lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia and goblet cells to produce mucus. We have a frontal sinus. There's a sinus in the frontal bone. There are sinuses in the sphenoid. It's a little deeper. Sinuses in the maxillae and sinuses in the ethmoid. So it's all in this region. If you ever get a sinus headache, it means one of these airways have been clogged, and now there's a buildup of pressure. Not fun. But that just means these tiny, tiny passageways have to get unclogged. These are air-filled chambers that help maximize surface area for those similar reasons: humidify, filter, warm up the air, and it helps lighten our skull. If we just had dense bone in our head would weigh even more. Our head's already decently heavy from our very complex brains. By having lighter bones, it helps reduce the amount of energy we need to do to carry our big heads around. 4 bones that are pneumatized. Remember, these are pneumatized bones. Frontal bone, sphenoid, maxilla, and ethmoid. The auditory ossicles are tiny, your smallest bones. Your auditory ossicles are your smallest bones in your body. They help you hear. The way they do this, if you can imagine your ear is over here. So this would be your right ear. Sound waves get into your external acoustic meatus of your temporal bone, filtered or help caught by your pinna, your auricles. That sound vibrates your tympanic membrane. We'll get to that later, but after vibrating the tympanic membrane, it vibrates 3 bones in succession. The first bone, the most lateral, which I'm going to color in pink. The most lateral bone is the malleus. Malleus means mallet. It's mallet shaped. You can see here, kind of like a little mallet. The middle intermediate bone, which I'm going to color in green, is called Incus. Incus means anvil. If you ever watch those Looney Tunes cartoons, anvil is like what drops on Wile E. Coyote. Or if you watch Game of Thrones or something, or some show where they're forging a sword, an anvil is a place where you put hot metal and hammer things out. Anyways, that's an anvil shape. The incus is an intermediate bone. It's anvil shaped. The final one, last one on the end here, the most medial of the bones, is shaped like a stirrup. A stirrup is the thing that if you ever climb onto a horse and you put your feet in, so like not the saddle, but where you put your feet in so that it's not dangling on anything. That's a stirrup. The word for stirrup is stapes. Malleus is lateral, incus is intermediate, stapes is medial. Three smallest bones in succession. The malleus vibrates, the incus vibrates, the stapes vibrates, which then causes vibration within this structure called the cochlea. This is your organ of hearing. We'll get to that later, but we rely on vibration of these bones to cause vibration within the cochlea so that we can hear things. Finally, the hyoid bone. Finally, before we look at complete anatomy, the hyoid bone is a single bone, and it's a really unique one because every bone that we've seen so far is bordering another bone. Even the malleus, incus, and stapes, they're off on their own deep in the ear, but they're still bordering each other. The hyoid does not directly border any bones. The word for bordering a bone is articulate. It does not articulate with any other bone. So the term for this is that it's floating. This is your one truly floating bone. And I don't mean that it's floating like levitating. It's floating as in it's suspended away from other bones. You can see the bone here in this picture. It's in your cervical region, and it's just above your, this is your thyroid cartilage where your Adam's apple is. Superior to that and deep, it's hard to reach because of all the muscle in the way. But this bone is the hyoid. If you pull it apart, it looks like this. By being a floating bone, by not articulating with anything, it's really mobile. There's nothing limiting its movement, which means you can move your tongue in many different directions. You can swallow easily without any restrictions on movement. Muscles, including your tongue and the muscles for swallowing, are attached to the hyoid. Skeletal muscles need to be attached to at least one bone to cause movement. You need an anchor. And here's one of the bones that allows for tongue movement and for swallowing. We'll take a look at the body, the lesser horns, and the greater horn in complete anatomy. All right, so we're looking at our semi-dissected skull here. Let's point out bones of the face first. Frontal bone kind of is in between cranial and facial. So we'll count this here. The frontal bone is also part of the face. Forms the superior portion of the bony orbit. Similarly, the sphenoid, which is very far back, also forms the posterior portion of the bony orbit. The ethmoid also forms part of the bony orbit, and these three are all part of the paranasal sinuses. You can see the lacrimal bone right here, very small bone. There's one of the lacrimal bones. You can see it on the other side if I click here. There's the other lacrimal bone. The zygomatic is lateral. Here's the zygomatic bone. There is one bone feature that I'd like you to know. Remember I said that the zygomatic is linking together the cranium and the face? It's what's yoking things together. The term for this protrusion of the zygomatic bone, since it's articulating with the temporal bone over here, this is known as the temporal process. It's the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. The temporal process of the zygomatic bone articulates with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. They complement each other. We have two nasal bones. If you've ever broken a nose, it's these bones here. These are the bones that form the bridge of your nose, like where you put your, I forget the word for this, where you put your eyeglasses or sunglasses on. That's the nasal bone, one on either side, also pretty small. Within the nasal cavity, remember you can see the ethmoid. And we've gone over the bone features that you should know in the previous video. But then forming the inferior portion of the nasal septum is the sphenoid. The vomer. Here's the vomer. It's hard to see the whole of it, so I'm going to isolate it. It's very thin, but then when you look at it from a lateral view, look at how it looks like a plow. That's the vomer. Just one of these separating the inferior portion of the nasal cavity. Back to the ethmoid. Not only does the ethmoid have the perpendicular plate forming part of the nasal septum, that's not the ethmoid. There we go. Not only does it have the perpendicular plate, the ethmoid, but it also has those nasal conchae, which you can see here. You can see the middle and superior nasal conchae. Middle and superior is hiding behind this. But then we also have one more bone here. Those are separate bones. They're not part of the ethmoid. These are the inferior nasal conchae. So there is one inferior nasal concha, there is the other. And if you isolate it, it looks just like a conch shell. Look at how curved it is. That's so that when you breathe air in through your nose, it gets swirled. You want to keep the air in your nose for a decent amount of time so that you're going over all that surface area to filter, humidify, and warm up air. These are very small bones as well. Inferior nasal conchae. The maxillae form the inferior portion of your orbits. They form the lateral walls of your nasal cavities, and they also form the roof of your mouth. They form the hard palate, and they have sockets for teeth. There's one maxilla here on the left, the other maxilla is here on the right. They also have paranasal, they're also part of the paranasal sinus group. So not only are they irregularly shaped bones, but they also are pneumatized. They have sinuses in them. So you can't see the picture here, but it does have the sinus. Because the teeth are fitting in to the maxillae, You can see this ridge here that I'm coloring in. This is known as the alveolar process. Alveolar processes, all those little bumps, because they stick out, alveolar processes. If you were to pull one of the teeth out and look at the space that the tooth is in, the term for the socket is an alveolus. The term for the socket is an alveolus. That's true for both the maxilla and the mandible. We've seen the word alveolus before for the lungs. Those are air sacs. Here is a socket for a tooth. Same word, different instances. If I hide one of the maxillae here, so we can better appreciate the hard palate, maybe hide some of the teeth. Here is the maxilla on the right side, looking from a mid-sagittal view. But then there's this bone here that I'll come back to an anterior view for. Here it is from an anterior view. Look at this flat portion here, and look at how the bone comes up. This is the Palatine Bone. The Palatine Bone also forms the hard palate, the posterior portion of the hard palate. So the Palatine Bone is L-shaped. The shorter, flatter part points medially on either side. We've gone over the maxillae, the Palatine bones, Zygomatic bones, Lacrimal bones, Vomer, nasal bones, inferior nasal conchae. The final one to go over is the mandible. If you recall, the frontal bone, when we were infants, used to be two bones, but then it fused together to form a single bone. And what was left was a frontal suture, but it's really a bony bone-to-bone fusion. The mandible, very similar to the frontal bone, used to be two bones, and then it fused together. It's why if you feel on your chin, you can feel this little indent. Some of you have bigger cleft chins than others. It's a genetic thing. But this point right here is where these two bones fuse together to form one single bone. Our mandible is just one bone. That cleft portion you can see right here. The mandible is your lower jaw. Like the maxilla, it houses your teeth. So these ridges down here, these are also alveolar processes. And then the socket where they fit in, that's also an alveolus. Or plural alveoli, all the different sockets. If we look from a lateral view, we can appreciate more features here. This curved portion of the mandible allows us to chew and to have force when we chew. If we just had kind of like how some birds' beaks are formed, if we just had a mouth like this, it would be harder to get leverage. But instead, our mouths are kind of like those really grippy wrenches. By having this curvature, we can get a lot more force when we chew. There's a term for this curvature. This curvature is called the Mandibular Ramus. The word ramus means curve. So the Mandibular Ramus allows us to get more force when we chew, when we bite down. You'll notice that there's a protrusion up here. It's not actually articulating with anything. It's hiding behind the zygomatic bone. This point, it's not actually articulating with anything. This is called the coronoid process. It doesn't articulate with any bones, but it does have attachment points for muscles. We'll get to that later. Where it does articulate with another bone, it articulates with the temporal bone right here. Remember, on the temporal bone, we have the mandibular fossa, but with the mandible, the part of the mandible that articulates from the mandibular fossa, this is called the condylar process. This makes up your temporomandibular joint, the condylar process of your mandible and the mandibular fossa of your temporal bone. Together make up your temporomandibular joint. You can see the hyoid down here. It looks like it's floating. It's actually attached by ligaments. But your hyoid is located right there. This most anterior portion is called the body. These parts that poke up on either side, those are lesser horns. And then the bigger ones that extend back, those are greater horns. If we cut in and look inside of the temporal bone, whoop, too far. Look inside the temporal bone, we can see those auditory ossicles in there. But I'm going to cut in. There's actually a link already where I've already cut it for you under videos. But I'm going to cut inside and hopefully get a good cut here. Let's see how we did. Oops. A little more. We can see that the auditory ossicles are exposed now. So the auditory ossicles, very small, are within this space of the temporal bone. You can see where I drew my arrow, that's the external acoustic meatus. This bone that's most lateral, that's the malleus. It's mallet shaped. You can see shaped like a little mallet. The incus is intermediate of the three. And then the stapes is most medial, facing the cochlea, that organ of hearing. And you can see it's got a little space in between. That's the malleus, the incus, the stapes. Those are the auditory ossicles, the bones that we need for hearing. All right, we've gone over all the bones in the head region, cephalic region, the cranial region, facial, and then auditory ossicles and hyoid. In the next video, we're going to go over bones of the vertebral column, all the different vertebrae, the sacrum and the coccyx. And then finally, for the axial skeleton for this chapter, we'll go over thoracic cage. So I'll see you in the next video. Let me know if you have any questions. Leave questions in the comments or talk to me later.